Professor Shiferaw, during the early 60s, growth in Africa was higher than in other developing countries. Leading economists believed Africa was more likely to grow than East Asia. No one predicted that the rise of the Asian tigers and the failure, Africa's failure to meet high growth expectations. How do you explain this?
The reason why African economies were expected to grow faster than Asian economies was basically because African economies have a lot of natural resource wealth, and the region is very close to Europe. And Europe was, of course, the major export destination for a number of developing countries. And also, there were a number of leaders in the post-independence era which were very promising and ambitious political leaders who promised significant economic transformation in African economies. But of course, this expectation was not met a few years after independence, simply because the economists undermined the importance of the political environment and the level of development of institutions to support the expected economic growth. So the moment political processes started to emerge and proceed, there were a number of obstacles. One of them was, of course, the Cold War, which expressed itself in many ways in terms of the allocation of aid and the intervention of foreign forces and powers in the internal politics of Africa. So one of the main disruptions for the growth performance in Africa, which was overlooked by many predictions, was the political instability in which a number of, or the large section of society was excluded from the political process, and the initial leaders became more and more autocratic, and the promises of democracy and participatory processes didn't materialize. And when you have political uncertainty and disruption, the first thing that it does is it diverts resources to less productive uses, like, for instance, building your military apparatus and trying to keep away your political opponents. And the other thing it does is it creates uncertainty for the private sector. So it becomes so volatile that you are not inclined to invest. We all know that economic growth in the long run depends on capital formation. So if investment is disrupted because of uncertain political environment, in the long run, economic growth will also be undermined. So the other thing that has been overlooked is the tendency for a number of African countries to follow protective trade policies. So the domestic market was not large enough, and they wanted to industrialize, which in itself was not a bad initiative, but it required policies which were essentially undermining the agricultural sector, which was the source of exports. So exports suffered, and there were not enough resources to boost the manufacturing sector. So the combination of those factors, the political instability, lack of investment, and bad policies which undermined agricultural growth and also manufacturing, I think were the main reasons for why African economies didn't do quite well as initially expected. For Asian economies, the reason why they were not really high in the expectations list for economists in the 1950s and 60s was simply because they're not very much blessed with natural resources, and they seem to have cultural institutions which are more of distributory in nature rather than savings oriented or growth oriented. But of course, what happened was that created a condition for rapid manufacturing, because people, when they don't rely very much on land and natural resources, of course, the next thing to do is to use your cheap labor for manufacturing purposes. So a combination of a number of factors, including FDI and export orientation or liberalized trade policies in some ways, at least in terms of allowing the export of labor-intensive commodities, was the main factor for why most Asian countries took off. Of course, there's a long story to it in terms of the support that they also received from the government in terms of promoting infrastructure, finance for the private sector, and also a sense of political stability in many ways, at least in a number of countries.
Since the mid-90s, African economies have started to recover, and growth during the last 3 or 4 years has been particularly high in such countries as Botswana, Rwanda, Ghana. So could we argue that some African economies are now about to follow the footsteps of the East Asian tigers?
This is a very interesting question. The fact remains that African countries have a lot of potential for a very fast economic growth. Now, comparison with East Asian economies is very tricky because, as we all know, the main reason behind the economic success of East Asian economies is because of the dynamic manufacturing sector. To what extent that can be repeated in Africa is a big question. It is possible in many ways because now infrastructure in a number of African countries is improving a lot. And over the last 20, 30 years, African countries have been investing on the education sector. So primary, secondary, even tertiary education has been growing rapidly in a number of African countries. And it's expected that cheap labor combined with an educated labor force is actually a good recipe or component for a rapid manufacturing sector growth. But one should not overestimate those factors because at the moment the market for manufactured goods is heavily dominated by East Asian countries like China and the former Asian tigers. So breaking into those markets is still going to be a challenge. And when it comes to European markets and the US market, at least in terms of the consumer goods market, they are very strongly guarded and controlled by global buyers. These global buyers essentially know what they want, and they have the liberty to choose the producers in developing countries at will in terms of incorporating them into the value chain. So, but what has happened in the last 10, 20 years is the requirements of these global buyers have been very stringent and very demanding in many ways. So the quality of products produced, the timeliness of delivery, and the possibility to provide supplementary services for the products to be supplied to European and US markets are so demanding that it has become too difficult for a number of African countries to break into manufactured exports market. So that's why, for instance, why the share of African countries has not started to pick up in terms of the share of the global market for manufacturers, which is supplied by developing countries. So there is a potential if they can join the value chains, but joining those value chains is still a challenge. Another important limitation, which still can be overcome or can be addressed, is the credit markets. Credit markets in Africa are still very much imperfect. Access to credit is a big problem for small and medium enterprises. So unless governments kind of create an environment where banks and development banks are willing to lend more finance for the private sector, especially for the small and medium enterprises, the fast growth that we have seen in Asian economies will probably not take immediately in Africa. This is partly related with the need for a large finance to undertake investment. So investment in most countries at the firm level, when we look at the data, takes place in lumps and bumps. It's not a smooth process. And if you want to make huge investment, and if that takes place in one go, you will need to accumulate a lot of finance from internal resources. And that, of course, is not the ideal situation, because ideally what you would like to have is a situation when you can access credit at a reasonable rate from the financial system, which you can translate into investment. So the key, again, is to what extent the investment climate is suitable for investment in the manufacturing sector. So if those things can be brought together, the finance, the stability, and accessing or breaking into the export markets by joining the value chains, I think there's a good chance for African countries to repeat the success that we have seen in East Asian economies.